The Spin-off Podcast Network.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. A podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
There's a radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. Made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-off or wherever you get your podcasts.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, Senior Writer at The Spin-off. We wouldn't exist without the ongoing support of our generous members. If you're able to, you can make a donation at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Okay, all right, let's press on. Okay.
With the magic of editing, we're zipping right back in there.
This is why people have to see us live, because otherwise we will never get a podcast out.
No mai, haere mai, this is Toby Manhire. It's gone by lunchtime. It's Wednesday, July the 10th. There are just 168 days until Christmas. Morena Annabelle Lee Mather.
Morena.
Kia ora Ben Thomas, piping in
Morena.
From Wellington, and Te Aihe Butler, making everything sing.
Morena.
A 3-point action plan for today. Christopher Luxon is in Washington, D.C., rubbing shoulders with the Nato crowd. Housing Minister Chris Bishop has unveiled a new policy to flood the market with property. But first, Darleen Tana. Not very often that a first-term MP makes such a big impression, but so it is with the Green, or until recently Green MP, Darleen Tana. And she managed to make a big impression while being almost completely invisible, impressively. To go back on this a little bit, Tana became embroiled in allegations that related chiefly to claims of migrant worker exploitation at her husband's e-bike business, which all sounds very much like it's out of central casting. And the Greens instigated an independent review. That review took quite a long time. It dragged on, in part, we now learn, because of some recalcitrance on the part of various witnesses, but also a 500-page submission landing just as the report was about to be completed. Came to a head on Friday night when the report was delivered. The Green caucus met and decided to turf Darleen Tana out of caucus. She said, "I quit," just before they did that. Then they wanted her to resign from Parliament as well. Then she ghosted them, as far as I can tell. Chloe Swarbrick, the co-leader of the Green Party, fronted a press conference on Monday, said basically that she felt as though they'd been betrayed. She felt as though they'd been misled, which she upgraded later to lied to. She said she was heartbroken, that she loved Darleen Tana as a colleague, and that this was a terrible thing to have befallen them all. Essentially, that seemed as though the allegation was, the feeling was that the story had changed multiple times over the course of the process. Obviously, migrant exploitation being at the centre of it is very bad for a party where their kaupapa stands so strongly against that. It's an interesting one, among other things, Annabelle, because it's like a bit of a donut. Like in the middle of the missing bit in the middle is the report, which we haven't seen. There have been some leaks of parts of it. And it's not entirely clear why the Greens simply haven't moved to release a redacted version. They say there are some issues around privacy with part of them. Where to now for the Green Party? Obviously, the question is whether or not to invoke the variously named waka-jumping or party-hopping bill. Difficult for the Greens because they have so vehemently opposed that bill, both in its original form at the start in 2001, I think it was, when the then Green Party co-leader Rod Donald, during the second reading of the Electoral Integrity Bill, described the legislation as the most draconian, obnoxious, anti-democratic, insulting piece of legislation ever inflicted on this Parliament. That sunsetted out, that bit, and then it came back again, and the Greens put the most enormous pegs on their noses and as part of the coalition requirements supported it through. So it puts them in a bit of a sticky spot about whether to invoke it or not. Where do the Greens go from here, Annabelle?
I think they are left with little choice but to not invoke it if Darleen refuses to resign. And while they might have put a peg on their nose when they voted for it, the die was cast when they voted for it. So I think to accuse them of hypocrisy now, it's too late. They were hypocritical when they voted for it. I think the New Zealand public has been quite generous with the Greens, that their voters held up through a number of scandals, but I think people's patience will be wearing thin and they need to look like they're taking decisive action on this issue, particularly given how long the investigation took. Now, apparently it wasn't their fault it took so long, it's because there was reluctance on behalf of those who were being investigated not to engage in the process. I think, there's been comments that the Green membership will be upset if they do use it, but I actually think that there's probably going to be sympathy within their ranks because of what's happened with Marama and Chloe and everything they've had to contend with. But I think this is one that they'll have to bite the bullet on. I think it would be different if Darleen had resigned over an issue of principle, like she didn't want to support the Kermadec sanctuary. Then I think it would be inappropriate to use the waka-jumping bill. But when it comes to exploiting a group of incredibly vulnerable New Zealanders, I think that takes that's of greater importance.
So you're saying you're saying they should use it. They should press the button on it and just, if need to, hit the ejector seat, use the party hopping waka-jumping.
If she refuses to resign, I think that's really the only thing they can do.
Ben?
Yeah, agree totally. I mean, like as Abel said, if you, we've all been in that position. You decide to go vegetarian, or you decide to go on a diet, or, you say, no more Coke or whatever, and then you slip midway through the day. You're okay for the rest of the day. And that's where the Greens are in this situation. When people say, I was so against it, well, they actually voted for it. So, it's, you can kind of dress that up however you like, but actually they were for the bill, whether they said they liked that or not. And that's the thing. When Rod Dold was talking about it and when critics of this bill tend to talk about it, they're imagining this sort of Banderton scenario of sort of, I didn't leave the party left me. I'm the one holding to the true values. Why should that be compromised by this power-hungry party structure? It's not about if you're a human trafficker and you're exploiting migrant workers.
You've swallowed the rat. You may as well claim the bounty for that delicious meal.
Just enjoy it, and have another one. And, and look, I think this is a wider question that some particularly progressive organisations have, I think, which is, they have these sort of values and principles that often tend to be sort of counterproductive and sort of almost used against them in the sense, you saw this, there's a really fascinating piece on The Intercept, kind of in the middle of the sort of BLM and the various reckonings in the United States during the pandemic, where they interviewed many sort of people from NGOs in Washington saying, we haven't been able to get any work done in the last 2 years because we've been so busy sorting out our own internal policies about sexism and racism and all that sort of thing. And you don't want, as a progressive organisation, to be sort of so hidebound by the kind of appearance, or the formal sort of observance of these values in terms of protecting Darleen Tana because she's a wahine Māori, and giving her, consensus kumbaya, sort of restorative justice and all that kind of thing, because you're actually in Parliament to represent people like exploited migrant workers who need you much more. And, you see things like this, I think Unite Union, I think the first few years they were fiercely fighting for, minimum wage workers and 0-hour contract workers in the fast food industry. None of their organisers were being paid the minimum wage. you know. And it was because it was a passion project, and they really they thought that advancing the cause was more important than just this formal observance of their own principles and their own organisation, to a fault. Which I think is where you draw the line, and where you would be if you sort of let Darleen stay in Parliament, disrupt the proportionality, just because you had sort of some principled stand against the waka-jumping legislation.
The difficulty for the Greens, of course, and Ben's touched on that, Annabelle, is that there is a certain level of, among those who dislike the Greens, there is a perception of a holier-than-thou-ness, a sort of piousness. And we've, I guess, joked a bit about, despite all the tribulations that the Greens have faced, and there have been many in recent months, their vote seems to have held up. And you can look at that two ways. You can say it's a solid, locked-in vote, or you could say, where would it be had they not gone through all these series of falls? It could be much stronger. Recently, the other day in the UK, the Greens got 7%, despite a system where they did get a few seats, but most of those people voting knowing they had no chance. There is some of that is because of the Labour Party in the UK being seen as being weak on the Gaza issue. There's some of that here too. The loss of Golda's Garaman is obviously an issue there, and that she was prosecuting that issue quite strongly. What's my question? My question is, does this sort of create a problem for the Green brand when we've got an issue around alleged migrant exploitation, when we've got a series of issues that have confronted them? Is it a bigger problem than waka-jumping or not?
I think what happens from here is critical. They've gone through the process. If they're too holier than thou to use the waka-jumping bill to stitch this up, then I think they will have a major problem in the eyes of the public. Obviously, there's been frustration about how long the process has taken, but I think people are willing to forgive them that. If now they have the information, they're prepared to do the right thing for it. And I think if they don't, then they'll be in trouble.
Right, let's skip forward to the housing issue. We had last week, it kind of got lost a bit, although it's continued to bubble away. Chris Bishop, much like God delivering a message to Noah, he spoke to the Real Estates Institute and called for a flood, said a flood would come, the housing market would be flooded as a result of his new housing policy. The backstory to this is in 2021, I think it was, when Judith Collins was the leader of the National Party, there was a cross-party accord on medium-density housing, and there was suddenly a kind of YIMBY moment, and the two big parties were sailing together towards density in housing. The urbanists were thrilled. And then Christopher Luxon said, no, you don't, during the election campaign, and I think to the frustration of some within National, he killed that. Chris Bishop, who's in charge of housing, promised that he would find a solution, and here it is. What it is amounts to the idea that councils will have to live zone development capacity up to 30 years, previously it was 3 years. It also kind of scotches the urban-rural boundary stuff, abolishes the minimum floor area for apartments. The goal being, I guess, Ben, here, one, to make a serious change in the housing market to address the housing crisis. Chris Bishop, surprisingly, and I think laudably, says that house prices should come down, which is a bit of a sacred cow. Some people wouldn't touch that, to say house prices need to come down, but also to provide a bit of a spur in terms of growth, which is what everyone is seeking. How did you see this announcement? Do you think it will turn the dial?
Look, with these things, a lot depends on the implementation. Even with the medium density rules, and before that, the rules around densification around transport corridors, you saw councils really fighting back on that, or in the case of Christchurch, just not doing it. And so, really execution is key here. Local government does tend to drag its feet on this, and part of part of the announcement was saying that maybe they'll be looking at incentives for local councils to actually encourage growth, and particularly sort of adverting to that ACT policy of, maybe they get half or all the GST of new housing builds. So there's actually sort of skin in the game for councils, who are struggling for money to allow new builds. And that will be it. He said in the speech, what's going to be really important is the mechanisms for making councils, making sure councils actually have that 30 years worth of growth available, at any given time. So it really is a devil in the details thing. I know he's got good people working on it. And really admirable to say that he wants housing prices to come down. In reality, this is nothing for baby boomers to cry and fret about. Their gigantic mansions in Mount Eden on huge full sections will still be worth more with greater densification allowed, because you'll be able to put apartments on it. What we're really talking about is more housing that people can afford, more apartments, more terrace houses, and that ilk.
Do you find it hard staying optimistic with all the financial news in the media? I'm Bernard Hickey, and on my podcast, When the Facts Change, I'm here to help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of economics in Aotearoa. So join the conversation every Friday on When the Facts Change, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBet.
Talofa lava. I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spin-Off. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spin-Off member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Annabelle, your view on this, do you think that it's a major moment in terms of changing the housing crisis that continues to be faced in New Zealand?
I think if we look at the housing crisis that we find ourselves in, it is due in no small part to the terrible quality of houses that were being built in the 90s and the 2000s, the leaky homes, which put us back, decades. And that is due in no small part to making it cheaper, faster, easier, and, pulling off, requirements around the quality of housing. So I think there's concern that by solving a short-term problem, we could be creating another long-term problem.
In terms of the sort of tiny apartment size, that sort of thing, do you mean?
In terms of the tiny apartment size, in terms of the no balconies for apartments, balconies are a great place to sit and have a cup of tea, but also when your shoebox apartment catches on fire and you and 500 of your neighbours are trying to quickly evacuate out of the building, balconies can be quite handy for, having another way to exit the building and to get help in. So I think there's that side of it, that we don't end up with a whole lot of Grenfell towers popping up all around the place. The other thing too is with the rural-urban boundary, are we potentially creating issues in terms of our food sovereignty in New Zealand, where we're covering up all of our rural land with housing and we no longer have the ability to feed ourselves? And then what's the knock-on effect of that in terms of greenhouse emissions if we're having to ship everything in or drive it in from great distances? I think the other concern for people is that this government seems to be very keen to overrule local body councils, but local body councils will be the ones who are left to figure out what happens in terms of the infrastructure, cleaning up any problems that happen later on. So while we talk a lot about democracy, it's not conducive to democracy when big government, or to use a tamapōtaka phrase, max kāwanatanga, is coming in and telling regional councils how they should be planning their towns and developing housing. Now, I think we've seen in the last couple of years, especially in our neighbourhood, Toby and Point Chev, we're seeing some good high-density housing popping up that's close to, buses and transport and all of those things, and it's happening quite cheaply. I think if you're really interested in solving the housing crisis, it's not so much about relying on developers who need to make a buck. It's about looking at some of the stuff that's happened over the last few years. Yes, not as much as what was promised, but certainly some good gains.
What do you think, Ben, about that relationship that Annabelle points up between central and local government? You, as a great champion of local government, you're very passionate about local body politics. We've seen a bit of a clash between the two Browns, your man Wayne Brown and Simeon Brown. There was that the Auckland Council pushing back on the attempt to remove speed limits, including around schools, the changes to those. But on this housing issue, as Annabelle points up, local bodies are being asked to do a lot of things, and yet at the same time there are questions about whether they're being funded to do all those things. They've asked for a long time, for example, for GST to be returned so that they can provide some of the infrastructural underpinnings for these growths that are required in terms of property development. You've got on top of that a perception that the government just is not that interested in the struggles of local government as epitomised in chucking the big, bulky review on local government, which took a couple of painstaking years, I think, to complete. That's just been chucked on the in the incinerator. Do local government getting a fair rub of the green?
Yeah, I mean, that review, there wasn't a great deal in there that was sort of particular worth. There was a bit of special pleading for more funding as usual, but a lot of it was just sort of, kind of really, kind of tweaking sort of, formal settings around councils that didn't really bear on the big problems that they've got. And look, Rob Campbell actually wrote a good piece about the Reserve Bank, and its intent on trying to crush any remaining inflation via higher interest rates for longer. And he said, well, the bank has said that some of the things contributing to so-called domestic inflation are things like council rates going up, but that's not because there's too much money circulating in the system and it's opportunistic price rises or whatever. It's because there has been underinvestment for a long time, both from central and from local government, in particular from local government. So there is this problem, chickens coming home to roost. We've seen that in water services, we're seeing it in infrastructure pretty much everywhere. So we are seeing large rate rises, and there probably does have to be a circuit breaker. Bishop, the other major announcement Bishop has made recently is about sort of future infrastructure funding of New Zealand. A big problem that we have is that we are not a particularly rich country, by developed world standards, but we want all of the things that developed world countries have, and there is going to be a pain point in terms of paying for a lot of this stuff. Whether it falls on ratepayers or taxpayers is, ultimately it's all coming from a pretty small pool of New Zealand citizens. I personally think that there's a bit of a disadvantage in the fact that part of these new rules are quote unquote allowing new developments to pay for their new infrastructure, ring fencing it so that it doesn't, fall onto, other residents. But at the same time, you're sort of like, well, those other residents didn't have to pay for the footpaths outside their houses or the water coming to their streets. Or the pipes rather. So, at what point, do you sort of say, well, actually, it's a sort of socialized good? And, there's still more discussion around that, but and local government has been a clearinghouse for central government problems for a long time. So, my ultimate solution is to make it all into, Department of Parks and Sewage. But that seems to be rejected by successive governments. So,
but actually, that was in a footnote in the report that was could have got pushed through if it hadn't been ditched. We've got to go quickly. We want to talk briefly about Christopher Luxon in Washington D.C. I think we could forgive him given his interest in global, great leaders. He must be having a moment as Prime Minister in Washington D.C. He's there as a member of, what's it called? Is it called the IP4? There's all these little groups of kind of Indo-Pacific clusters of countries there to buttress the Western Alliance in various forms. This one is, I think, New Zealand, Australia, South Korea and Japan. Forgive me if I've got one wrong. I think that's right. Who are there to as sort of tag-alongs, to use a term that Christopher Luxon has invoked on Nato. There to just be around and have a nice dinner and have some meetings, have some pull-asides. Everyone loves a pull-aside. Christopher Luxon is maybe even...
Where are we on the NATO list in terms of helping defeat Russia? Are we sort of like C, B, B plus?
Yeah, I think we're a fair way down that. I think maybe F or G, but
we've got our hands full containing North Korea.
That's right. We've got a lot on. Annabelle, is this an important meeting? I'm wondering whether Christopher Luxon's great effort here could be to take an All Black jersey, because Big Joe Biden loves the All Blacks. Give him an All Black jersey and sort of persuade him not to stand for the presidency again.
I reckon that, like, Luxon, who is obviously a fan of the US and probably, like us, watched a lot of US films in the 80s, for him it's going to be like starring in his own real-life version of Weekend at Bernie's, getting to meet Joe Biden. That'd be cool.
Maybe to use another 80s cinematic genre, he could do a body swap. So he could persuade Joe Biden that Joe Biden is the Prime Minister of New Zealand and just Christopher Luxon could become the president.
Yes.
Which is obviously that would be cool. He'd like that, I think. That would be, I don't know if that's on the list. And then Joe Biden would be the New Zealand Prime Minister.
Yeah, what is it? Scary Friday, whatever.
Exactly,
I love
like
it.
that.
Yes,
Yep.
great idea.
What other ambitions do you have for this Washington DC high-level summit, Ben Thomas?
Yeah, I'm still just sort of imagining, for the pull aside, the aides will sort of tap Christopher Luxon on the shoulder and sort of say, the president is over here, and they'll be like, as you approach him, just put your arm under one shoulder, we can't find a corner to prop him up against. These could be, Luxon's could have the final dispatches from free America. So, I'm planning a trip as well. So, we should enjoy it while it lasts.
I think it's quite a smart move by the US getting Luxon to chair one of the sessions. I think they recognise that he has a really hard sell here in terms of AUKUS, and so building him up on the world stage and getting him to host a session, I think they hope that by enhancing his mana, it might make it a bit easier to get it over the line with New Zealand. But I ultimately don't think it will.
Just hoping that some of that famous Christopher Luxon mojo rubs off on their guy, and then everything will be fine. All right, that's enough. Let's go. We will return anon with another podcast. Thanks.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at the Spin-off. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spin-Off member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate. The Spin-Off Podcast Network.